All right, let's take a look at some Keynesian economics. So Keynesian economics, these are the interventionists, macroeconomists. They look at aggregate demand as being the primary factor that affects economic output, different than the classical economists who are all about aggregate supply. So John Maynard Keynes, he didn't invent this curve. He was the biggest proponent of government spending of his time, but his ideas have since been captured in this aggregate supply curve called the Keynesian aggregate supply curve. How does it work? Well, it all depends on what is aggregate demand at any given moment. So if aggregate demand is relatively low compared to some of the examples I'm about to give you, we see here that price levels are as low as they can be at P, but we also see that output is far from YF, output at Y. This is a large deflationary gap, a large output gap. We are far from the full level of output. So if we're able to, over time, increase AD because consumption and or investment, government spending, or the foreign sector improves, any of those increase, we'll see that price levels will stay the same. So consumers are not going to be paying any more for their goods, but output is going to go up. And why is this? It's because from Y to YF was such a tremendous gap. So many people were unemployed, so many factors of production weren't being used, that to make the little jump from AD to AD1 and use some of those factors of production really cost firms so little that prices didn't go up, while we are enjoying as a nation an increase in output. As the economy improves from here to 82, we see that output is increasing again from Y1 to Y2 in this case, but price levels are starting to go up. And this is the demand pull inflation that is acceptable. As aggregate demand increases, yes, price levels are going up, but we'll take it because output is going closer to YF, meaning unemployment is being reduced and the economy overall is growing. And then we get to AD3, which is in many ways like the sweet spot of the economy. This is where we have full level of output because AD3 hits AS here and it goes down to the full level of output. And price levels are at P3. You might say, well, that's not as low as P or P2, but I'll take them if it means full level of output, which also translates to a very low level of unemployment. We're at the full level of employment at YF as well, where we have some natural unemployment and nothing else. And then theoretically the economy could continue to grow in that, I should say, consumption, investment, government spending could all increase, or one of those could increase. And what would happen is AD would go up, price levels would go up, so there's some more inflation there, but output is at this point constrained to YF. We're not going to get any more output because at this point, even though AD is high, we no longer have the ability of the factors of production. Our workers, our factories, as examples, can no longer produce anymore. So AD3, that's an ideal. AD4, it shows the economy almost growing too quickly. Anything less than AD3 shows that we don't have full level of output. So how do we increase output and promote growth when necessary? AD should naturally increase over time, which will lead to an increase in output. Why will AD increase over time? Well, some examples are consumption by households will increase as wages grow, or investment by firms will increase as investment prospects improve. So if I just give it time, I will expect AD to go up, and that's why when we draw the business cycle, in the long term, we say that output will increase. But these policies can also be used not only at any time, but especially during a recession, when you should look at adjusting AD. And there's two ways to do this, fiscal or monetary policy. So it's easy to diagram. Economy is at AD. If I want to get to AD1, an increase in consumption or investment or government spending, or an improvement in the foreign sector, really consumption, investment, or government spending, I can do that. I can see an increase in output, and again, it comes with that increase in price levels, but I'll take it because the increase in output is really my goal here. How do I do that? Well, I can use expansionary fiscal policy, and that's done by using the government budget. I can decrease taxes to increase consumption. I can decrease corporate taxes to get more investment from firms, or I can, as the government, just straight up increase government spending. Positives to this is compared to monetary policy, which we're about to discuss, it is much more immediate, and we can target specific section or sectors of the economy, it should really say, such as let's say I notice that investment is fairly weak and I want to bolster investment. I can simply cut corporate taxes, leaving the other two factors alone, and bolster the investment factor of AD to try to jumpstart the economy. The negative is when I do these things, decrease taxes and increase government spending, it tends to lead to deficits, which over time can build up public debt. Make sure you know the difference between the two. And also government budgets are very political. So politicians are elected, let's use the United States as an example, 435 representatives in the House of Representatives. They each have their own agendas, representing their own people, in their minds at least. And in order to do that, they need to walk away with certain things happening that they think will benefit their people. And not all 435 people may agree sometimes, and that may have negative implications for the national economic health. So the alternative is expansionary monetary policy, which uses base interest rates to increase aggregate demand. So the example is, or the way it always happens, will be the central bank will reduce the base interest rate. In the United States, that's the Federal Reserve. In the European Union, it's the European Central Bank. As examples, banks will respond by lowering their interest rates. So the central bank reduces its base interest rate. It's the rate that it loans to individual banks, private banks. And then the banks will respond by taking what is essentially cheap money, or cheaper than they used to get it from the central bank, and extending more loans or lower interest loans to firms for investment, or also to households for consumption. But really it's firms who are mostly going to banks to get loans. So monetary policy is targeting primarily that investment part of the C plus I plus G plus X minus N formula. What's the benefit of monetary policy? Central banks usually operate separate from electoral politics. So we'll use the United States example again. We nominate a chairman to the Federal Reserve, and that person determines with the Board of Governors what the interest rate's going to be, and that person doesn't get voted in or out by the people. They get appointed by the president and approved by Congress. And so they don't have to worry about doing what's popular at any given moment. They have to worry about the long-term national economy. It's also very subtle. It's not directly tied to the government budget like fiscal policy, so it avoids those political problems even more. Unfortunately, monetary policy has time lags, though. If you look at the process here, starting with the central bank to influence investment and consumption, there are multiple steps. There's that middleman of the private banks that have to respond. Just because the central bank, for example, lowers the base interest rate doesn't mean that banks are going to suddenly change their habits. It happens over a long period of time. Also, you can't use it indefinitely, and that's the problem that we're seeing in some cases where if a bank already has an interest rate of 0.25% or 0%, you can't reduce it any more than that, so monetary policy is effectively off the table. Before we look at aggregate supply, I'm just going to jump here again. I can show expansionary fiscal policy or monetary policy through this diagram. It's really in the explanation that's key, but I would say by pursuing fiscal policy, blah, 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 explain, I will move increase aggregate demand AD to AD1, which will lead to an increase in price levels P to P1, but more importantly, an increase in output Y to YF. Ignore that little subscript 1 there on Y1, just Y to YF. So aggregate supply is that, again, that funky curve. Just like the LRAS curve in the classical view, the funky Keynesian curve can also shift to the right over time, and for all the same reasons that the LRAS curve would shift to the right when we talked about classical economists. So here's an example. Here again is an equilibrium in the Keynesian model. The economy is doing especially well, and by improvements in the supply side of the economy, you can see that price levels went down. That's great. Output goes up from YF to YF1. That's excellent. So overall, this is great that the supply side improved. And you can actually achieve this through interventionist supply side policy too. This is when the government steps in by putting money into developing technology, increasing or improving education, increasing or improving healthcare, or improving national infrastructure, All these things can improve factors of production. The problem is that these policies are all costly to the government, meaning that if the government spends money on, for example, education, now they can't spend on military or provide money to other projects that would be considered worthwhile. And when the government pays the price, it's all of us, it's all of society paying a price. So interventionist supply-side policies, they bear this problem of cost. The other issue with interventionist supply-side policy is it's not always appropriate. Look at this example here. Here AD is fairly low. It's symbolic of a weak economy because there is a deflationary or output gap here. There is output at Y, but the full level of output's all the way over here. If I were to pursue any sort of supply-side policy, be it interventionist or free market supply-side policy, you could see that I just made the gap between Y and YF even bigger. Now it's Y to YF1. So this is why the Keynesians wouldn't use interventionist supply-side policy unless AD was really strong and there was a lot of C plus I plus G plus X minus M. It also shows why they're not huge fans of supply-side policy in general, because unless the economy is really strong, supply-side policy just widens the deflationary gap, it widens the output gap. So let's look at one last thing. Let's look at instances where it might be appropriate for the government to pursue contractionary demand-side policy. So an economy could reach a point where AD is growing, however output is not increasing. It's purely inflationary. Growth can be slowed through contractionary demand-side policy. Alternatively, we can improve factors of production, as we just looked at, using interventionist supply-side policy. But let's look at this example here. Here we see AD is increasing from AD to AD1, and what's happening? Price levels are going up, output staying the same, purely inflationary, not good. How can I slow it down? Using contractionary fiscal policy is one alternative. This is the opposite of expansionary fiscal policy, where I'm going to use the government budget to decrease AD. I increase taxes to deter consumption. I increase corporate taxes to decrease investment by firms. Or I just, as the government again, decrease government spending. Why does it work? Well, again, compared to monetary policy, it has a more immediate effect. It also can target specific sectors of the economy, but it's politically unpopular. Depending on exactly what type of policy, how you're going to pursue this, you're going to have higher taxes and less government services, or at least one or the other, and people tend not to like that, so elected officials are wary of voting yes on a budget that might include this. Well, contractionary monetary policy, again, the opposite. The central bank increases the base interest rate, making it less likely that banks will offer low interest rates. In fact, they're going to increase their interest rates because they want to make money. They might borrow from the national bank at 2%, so they charge their customers 5% to make a profit. And so there's less money available for investment and for consumption. And same pros, that the central bank operates separate from politics and it can be very subtle. But the negative is the time lags. So if you're trying to slow down economic growth because the economy is growing too quickly with negative effects, you might use fiscal policy instead. But if you notice that the economy is especially strong, some contractionary monetary policy can keep it in check. So one more time, here we see AD increasing, and I could slow it down using contractionary policy that I just went over. And while this is inevitable, prices going up and output staying the same, I can just have that happen over a longer period of time using contractionary policy, slowing the shift of AD to AD1. Alternatively, I can go back to those supply-side policies, and by shifting AS over, I can make it so that after AD shifts from AD to AD1, ignore AD after the shift. Instead of prices going from P to P1, prices will stay at P. Another way of looking at it is if aggregate demand increases, price levels will go up, output will stay the same, but then if I improve the supply side, price levels will go back down to this new intersection, and output will go to this new level of output. So that is duly beneficial. And so there is a wrap-up of Keynesian economics.